Daniel Perlman is a psychologist studying personal relationships. He graduated from Bard College in 1964 and pursued graduate studies leading to a PhD from the Claremont Graduate School in 1971. He then spent 14 years in the psychology department at the University of Manitoba, followed by 14 more years at the University of British Columbia. In 2007, he moved to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro to become chair of the psychology department. James White is a family sociologist who recently retired from the University of British Columbia. Both White and Perlman were members of Martin's dissertation committee at UBC, but neither of them are experts in religious studies. Todd Martin earned a bachelor's degree in sociology and theology before completing his PhD in sociology at the University of British Columbia in 2013. He has gone on to become a professor at Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia, not far from Vancouver. This article, published while he was still in graduate school, reflects his own interests in religion with guidance in research methods from the senior faculty members advising him.
With the article by Martin, White, and Perlman, we are not asking the what questions about religion as a social institution, but rather the how questions. We take for granted that religions exist as institutionalized structures in society. However, we may have decided to define what religion means and which institutions qualify for the label. Whatever it might be, it is out there as one feature of that social reality that we each encounter. But here we ask a new question. How does a person end up as a member of such religious groups? How does it come about that any given person accepts the doctrines and the rules for living of a particular religion and acts in ways that sustain and perhaps even strengthen that religion as a group phenomenon? Among theologians, a vigorous debate continues about what is often called the natural knowledge of God. If it is in our very nature as human beings to become religious, to believe in the sacred, then the question is at least partly answered. But of course, there are objections to this natural knowledge of God idea. For example, an opposing argument insists that people start out totally alienated from God, perhaps by something like original sin for some Christians, or perhaps just by the corrupted nature of this material universe for Buddhists. Only when believers already in a religion reach out to them, preach to them, communicate with them, can they discover God and religious truths. And there are other nuances in this debate as well. But even the strongest proponents of the natural knowledge argument usually describe this as a potentiality in people, a hunger, a need, a sort of spiritual construction site that is ready and waiting for something to be built on it. In one time and place, that construct may be Theravada Buddhism. In another time and place, the person may become a Shiite follower of Islam, or perhaps a Southern Baptist, or a Mormon, or a Scientologist. So what Martin, White, and Perlman want to know is, how does that construction process work? How exactly do you take a little human baby and eventually produce the Buddhist, or Muslim, or Baptist, or Scientologist? They cite a lot of research suggesting that this process usually starts very early in life, involving childhood and especially adolescence, and that other institutional features turn out to play key roles in the construction activity. That body of existing research has established a fairly strong consensus that one social institution in particular plays a very strong central role in the process of religious socialization, the family. This evidence from research probably brings great comfort to parents everywhere, whether they want fervently to transmit their own particular religious beliefs and practices to their children, or perhaps feel strongly that they want to keep their children out of the grasp of any particular religion. Either way, the research findings seem to say they have a pretty good chance of succeeding. This isn't all that surprising, given how much time, control, and responsibility parents are given over the lives of their children. Children learn a tremendous amount from their parents. Religion is just one facet of this general result. But Martin, White, and Perlman also admit that all of that research on family inheritance of religion finds some confusing details. Sometimes it looks like mothers have more influence, other times that it is fathers. There are enough contradictions and inconsistencies in this religious linkage between parents and children that these authors go looking for some other possible sources of socialization that might be causing the confusion. Another possibility that they find explored in the research literature involves the larger formal organizational structures of each religion itself. In some religions, the believers gather together regularly to engage in group rituals, such as prayer, singing, dancing, and other activities. In addition to serving as an umbrella to unite individual families of believers into a larger community, the religion itself may organize special schools for children, like the Islamic madrasas. It may deliberately and systematically separate children from their parents and send them out into the world on missions like the Mormons, where they will have nothing to fall back on except the religion itself. The religious organization may support summer camps, youth rallies, traveling music groups, and other social forms that reinforce religious beliefs and practices. Such institutionalized social forms can make stronger believers even out of young people whose immediate families may not be all that religious. But nobody grows up inside a hermetically sealed bubble of a parental family. The larger organizational structure and activities of an institutionalized church is just one of the other dimensions of social life that we each experience, and which each might influence the socialization process, might contribute to who we become and how we connect to or disconnect from that organized religion. A third feature of adolescence in particular appears in most research about how people become religious in different ways and to different degrees. The peer group has emerged and claimed an increasingly prominent role in the social lives of young adults, especially in U.S. society of the late 20th century. If your friends have nothing to do with the religious traditions and beliefs that you might have experienced as a little child, that peer group might redirect your identity and your life choices in a very different direction. You might disconnect from a religious heritage altogether, or if your family finds itself in a tiny religious minority, a circle of friends drawn from some more dominant religious group, as for example for a Jewish family living somewhere in the American Midwest where almost everybody else is Christian, those friends might pull you towards some new faith instead of your own family's heritage. Or, of course, you might choose your closest friends from among other families within your own religious tradition, in which case the peer group could reinforce your childhood religious experiences and identity. Martin, White, and Perlman combine all of these possible influences according to the channeling hypothesis advanced by several other scholars in the 1980s and 1990s, so that all these influences can operate at the same time. This channeling idea sees the family as the first institutional setting where very young children begin to get signals about the details of organized religion. Later on, their parents may steer a child into participation in the religious organization through experiences like Sunday school, a madrasa, summer camp, weekend classes, and all kinds of youth activities. Parents also have at least a possibility to affect a child's choice of friends, and this kind of parental navigation into certain peer groups and particular church organizations is what is meant by channeling. Their figure 1 in the reading outlines this hierarchy of influences that shape a person's faith and religious identity. Once we have this framework for thinking about it, several specific questions arise, and Martin, White, and Perlman want to find empirical, quantitative answers to each of them. How important is each link in this chain? Is it there at all? Is it strong or weak? The first such link they want to measure is the effect of the parental family itself directly to predict the religious identity of children as they grow up. The second level of influences they seek to measure concerns the effect of organized religious groups on one hand and of peer groups on the other once children are old enough to add these potential influences to their social environments. Third, and finally, they also want to know how much influence the parental family has in determining a child's level of involvement in an institutionalized church, and how much influence that family has on a child's connection to a peer group. Even if they can't demonstrate a direct effect of families on faith, once we also consider the church and the peer group, it may be that the family still has a powerful indirect effect on faith, by determining these later social settings, and so also the resulting religious identity. Their central research question concerns the relative importance of these direct versus indirect paths of influence for parental families. Now that we understand the logical outline of the questions they have asked, we're ready to consider how they propose to find answers based on empirical evidence from American society. To examine the possible paths by which parents might transmit religious identity to their children, Martin, White, and Perlman need some observations of real families, real parents, real children, observations that include details about religious beliefs and behavior. Such information is hard to come by. For one thing, the U.S. constitutional separation of church and state means that no official government records or statistics ever contain religious information about anybody. So that kind of research using administrative records won't work. Instead, this research relies on questionnaires filled out by about 2,400 respondents between 7th and 12th grade. These junior high and high school students were chosen because they belonged to one of 900 different churches all over the United States, chosen from the congregational listings of 6 mainline Protestant denominations. So right away, we must recognize that all of these respondents belong to churches. There are no cases here of families that did not belong to any church. We can talk about what makes for success in cultivating religious identities in families, but not about what makes for failure in maintaining or transmitting such identities. We also have to remember that we're looking only at churches in the United States, not any other countries, and that this sample includes no Catholics or Muslims or Buddhists or even fundamentalist evangelical Protestant denominations. These are the mainline Protestant denominations only: Disciples of Christ, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and United Church of Christ. Researchers tried to include Southern Baptists, but non-response problems led to leaving them out of the analysis too. The Southern Baptists that did show up in the sample, as noted in this article, answered questions quite differently from young adults in the other mainline Protestant denominations. So from the start, we know for sure that results we find here may not apply to other religious groups. Still, at least this information is a start. Next, we need to focus on exactly what this study means by religiosity. Trying to measure how religious a person is can go in many directions. We can measure what people do, how often they go to church, how much money they give as offerings, what kind of other religious activities they do besides worship services, whether they pray outside of church, how often, whether they do this alone or with others, and so on. Or we can ask them what they believe. Do they believe in God? Do they believe in heaven and hell? Do they believe in miracles? This list also can go on for quite a while. So what is the measure of religiosity that Martin, White, and Feldman have to use, the measure that was collected in the survey data that they want to analyze? This measure was called faith maturity, a composite score or index based on 8 different specific items. Some of these 8 items are pretty standard, at least for Christians, although they wouldn't mean much if you were studying Muslims or Buddhists. For example, the survey question asked these junior high and high school students about trusting in God's grace and believing that Jesus was divine and not just another human. But the 8 items also contain some fairly controversial items that would not sit very well with fundamentalist Christians. The denominational executives, seminary professors, and researchers who made up the questionnaire represent a generation of church leaders who started their careers mostly in the 3rd quarter of the 20th century and who have emerged as an extremely liberal leadership generation, much more so than the rank and file even in the relatively liberal mainline Protestant denominations. This may explain why faith maturity also includes questions about commitment to racial and gender equality, advocating global social change, and other tenets of what is usually called the social gospel. So we also need to keep in mind that faith maturity is a very special kind of measure of religious identity, and that there may be other quite different kinds of strong religious identity, even among Christians in the United States. This is the measure that Martin, White, and Perlman found in the survey responses they wanted to analyze, so of course this is what they had to study. The rest of this story about their research design involves ways that they tried to measure the different factors that might explain variations in how students responded to the faith maturity questions. These different factors included features of their parental families, their involvement with the church as in a social organization or institution, and the context of peer relationships in which they lived. For each of these three factors, we need to come up with specific questions to measure their influence on the students. In the case of parents, two kinds of information were available from the questionnaire. First, we know something about the shape of the parental family. Most students lived with both parents, but some lived with only one parent. We also know about the educational backgrounds of these parents. We can put all these factors together in the category of characteristics of parents. Second, students indicated how much they had talked with their parent or parents about personal issues and religious questions, including separate questions about mothers and fathers. We can put all these items together in the category of interactions with parents. For measuring the impact of organized church congregations on these students, several questions from the survey provided different kinds of information, but all of it boiled down to questions about whether these students had been interacting with adults in the congregation. This actually seems kind of strange because there's no mention in these measures of how often the students simply attended church or Sunday school, or how often they participated in other non-worship activities, such as organized youth group activities. It may be that the people who designed the survey wanted to include all of that kind of activity in the peer group category, but this leaves us with a rather limited one-dimensional measure of congregational influence on the students. Finally, turning to the important question of peer group influence, survey questions ask the students to think of their closest friends and then ask how religious each of these friends were. Participation in organized youth group activities also showed up here in the peer group category, even though this also might have been counted instead as part of the influence of the organized church congregation. So one way or another, the survey of about 2,400 junior high and high school students does offer Martin, White, and Perlman enough information to measure all of the alternative explanations they have on hand to try to explain variations in the faith maturity of these young adults. So long as we keep clearly in mind who was included in the sample and who was not, and in the specific ingredients that went into this measure of faith maturity, we're ready to examine the results that they found. Martin, White, and Feldman examined 5 hypotheses that they expected to be true for the junior high and high school students who reported on their faith maturity in the 1988 survey results. The first of these predicted that faith maturity scores would be higher for students who had more frequent and meaningful conversations with their parents about personal and religious issues. This turns out to be true. The asterisks shown for these effect coefficients indicate that these parental effects are both highly significant for mothers and for fathers, with a slightly larger effect for mothers. So they find empirical support for their first hypothesis. They also find even stronger coefficients indicating that students with higher faith maturity scores are more likely to report interacting with adults in their church congregations, on one hand, and to have more religious friends and to participate more in church youth group activities on the other. These two effects support what they call the channeling hypothesis, that both organized congregations and peer groups have an effect on religious identity of children and young adults. But this is only part of the channeling hypothesis. If we think of these two contexts as channels, this amounts to saying that the influence they have on faith maturity actually carries or transmits some kind of prior influence that is being channeled through them. And of course, this prior influence is the same parental effects that we just considered in their first hypothesis. So to complete the test of the channeling hypothesis, Martin, White, and Feldman need to consider whether parental characteristics and interactions with parents also predict the student's involvement with church congregations and peer groups. This is where their third hypothesis comes into play. They expect that how students interact with adults in the church congregation on one hand and with their peers on the other will itself be a reflection of how they're interacting with their parents. This turns out to be only partly true. As they report in the article, they do not find any significant link between how the students interacted with their parents and how active they were in contacts with other adults in their church congregations. There are no arrows indicating this path in the diagram shown here. This means that the positive effect of interaction with other adults in the church is not channeling some kind of parental influence. It is simply another separate influence of its own on faith maturity. But their analysis does find a strong link between parents and peers. These very significant positive coefficients tell us that the students who interacted more with their parents about questions of faith and other personal concerns also were more likely to have friends who were more religious and to get involved more in church youth groups. These friends and youth group activities, in their turn, then predicted higher scores on the Faith Maturity Index. So here we see exactly what the authors expected. The influence of parents operates indirectly by channeling the students into certain kinds of peer situations, and these peer situations then predict their faith maturity scores. So all of the concern and advice that parents have been giving their children about choosing the right friends and the right activities turns out to be well-founded. This selection of friends and activities does appear to lead to certain predictable outcomes in terms of faith maturity as measured in these survey responses. Finally, the channeling hypothesis predicts that once we take into account this indirect effect of parents influencing peer groups, the direct effect of families on the faith maturity score should decrease. Part of this direct effect that we observed at first has been explained away as an indirect effect channeled through the peer group activities of these students. This is indeed what Martin, White, and Perlman found. The original coefficient for direct influence of mothers drops from 0.152 to 0.122, and the coefficient for direct influence of fathers drops even more, from 0.136 to 0.081, reducing its statistical significance. So the overall picture that they expected to find does indeed appear in these statistical tests, with the exception that they did not find a link between the parents and how much students interacted with other adults in their congregations. They tell one story about all of these numbers, the story they call the channeling hypothesis. We can think of that story in terms of the arrows that appear in the diagram, always starting with the parents and always ending at the faith maturity measure. This means that the parents, churches, and peer group can be thought of as causes, and the faith maturity measure amounts to an effect. But this is only one way to think about these numbers, about the results that they found. As you become familiar with this kind of research, you must recognize that such statistical tests only establish that two things show parallel variations, such as variations in how much you talk to your parents about personal things and how high you score on the Faith Maturity Index. By itself, such a parallel variation does not tell us which is the cause and which is the effect. This is the Achilles heel of all such statistical modeling and social research. A measure of association is not evidence of causation. For example, we could tell many different stories about the numbers that Martin, White, and Perlman have shown us. We might say that parents cause faith maturity, and then that faith maturity of students causes them to talk more with adults in their congregations and to choose friends who are also more religious. In this story, the peers and the congregation are results, not causes. On the other hand, we might tell a story in which the peer group choices of students determine their faith maturity, and then that faith maturity leads them to talk more with their parents about religious issues. In this case, the parental link becomes a cause. The story, as these authors tell it, is a plausible one, perhaps more plausible than these others just mentioned. But you should keep in mind that the question of the chicken and the egg, of the direction of causation, remains problematic and important in this as in all social research. The other thing to keep in mind as you reflect on these results is that, like a lot of research in the sociology of religion, this study concerns only contemporary young adults from a very specific selected sample of Protestant Christian churches in the United States. The question of generalizability of how far you can extend these conclusions into other populations in other times and places also remains as a challenge for you and for all researchers.